Welcome. Today we're going to learn about FOIL and also difference of squares. So we're going to start with an example of the FOIL method. So basically we use FOIL when we're multiplying two binomials. As you can see in our example, we have 2x plus 7. There are two terms there, so therefore we call that a binomial. And then there's 3x minus 5. And we're trying to multiply these two together. So a good way to do this is to use the FOIL method. So how does it work? Well, it's basically an acronym. The first letter F stands for first. So if you look at our terms, you can see I've circled the first terms in each binomial, okay? So you take those two first terms, which in this case is 2x and 3x, and you multiply them together, and then we would get, in our case, 6x squared. The second letter in FOIL is O, and that stands for outer. So now again, you go back to our two binomials and you look at the outer terms, which I have circled, 2x and minus 5. You multiply them and you get, in this case, negative 10x. Next letter in FOIL is I for inner. So again, go back to your two binomials. You're now multiplying the inner terms, which in this case are 7 and 3x. And you do that and you'll get 21x. And then last, we have last. The L stands for our last terms. So again, go back to your two binomials. You're going to pick the last term in each binomial. In this case, it's 7 and minus 5. Multiply them and you get minus 35. Now, we've done the first, the outer, the inner, and the last terms. We've multiplied them together. And now what we want to do is add them all up. So in step 1, we have our binomials that we're going to multiply. In step 2, we have the results that we just spoke about for our FOIL. And we put them all together and added them up. And then in step 3, we simplify. In this case, the outer and the inner terms are minus 10x and 21x. And since they are like terms, right, both of them have only an x in them. So they have that in common. You simply add them, and 21 minus 10 is 11, so you get the result in 3. And so that was FOIL. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is difference of squares. And basically it's a way to factor something that is in that form, difference of squares. So here's an example. So if we have, for example, 4x squared minus 1, okay? Now, how you know that you can utilize the concept of different squares here is, if you look at it, you'll notice the first term, 4x squared. It's a perfect square. Okay, in other words, if you take 2x and you square that, you're going to get 4x squared. So we know that that is a perfect square. If you look at the other term, the 1, well, 1 is always a perfect square because 1 times 1 is 1. So you can utilize difference of squares here because you have a perfect square on the first term, you have a perfect square on the second term, and it's called difference of squares, so there's going to be a difference in between. The difference is your minus sign, okay? So if you have two perfect squares and a minus sign in between, you're good to go. So how do we go about factoring utilizing difference of squares? Well, basically 4x squared, I told you, is 2x squared. So you want to write down that first term as 2x. Then you want to look at the other term, which was 1, and what squared is 1? 1. So that's your other term. So you're dealing with, now when you factor, you're going to deal with 2x and you're going to deal with 1. And then what you're going to do is you're going to break this up into two binomials, and you're going to put a plus sign in between one set of them and a minus sign in between the other. And you can see that here on this diagram. So going ahead and doing that, you basically have factored 4x squared minus 1 into two binomials, 2x minus 1 and 2x plus 1, basically two factors. And that's how you utilize difference of squares. The concept can only be used, though, if you have two perfect squares and a minus sign in between. Now let's just confirm that we did this correctly by going backwards. Let's start with our factors, 2x minus 1 and 2x plus 1, and let's use FOIL to see what we get. So we do that. The first terms, 2x times 2x, the outer terms, 2x times 1, the inner term, minus 1 times 2x, and the last terms, minus 1 times 1. We multiply them together, we add all those up, and you wind up with what you have in number 3, and then you simplify. The 2x is disappear because it's 2x minus 2x, and you wind up with 4x squared minus 1, and that's what we started when we started to utilize difference of squares. So we have confirmed, going the other direction with FOIL, that we factored 4x squared minus 1 correctly. And that is FOIL and difference of squares. Now go practice, practice, and practice some more.